Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Board Games Unlocked, and today I'm doing a no run-through review for Ragnarocks, which is the newest game by Gray Fox Games and designer Gordon Hamilton, who designed Santorini. So this is kind of his follow-up, not counting Santorini, New York, because that game title is absolutely stupid. So this is another kind of asymmetrical 1v1 style game that is similar to Santorini in that aspect. And I apologize ahead of time because I'm most likely going to be making comparisons to Santorini. And I know Santorini had a lot of buzz whenever it came out, like its production value and just kind of the nature of each individual player powers and kind of that head-to-head nature. And I still to this day am enthralled with Santorini. I think it's a wonderful head-to-head kind of chess-like asymmetrical game that utilizes cool player powers that I feel are balanced. Obviously, they have come out with, their rule book that showcases, hey, don't play these against others because they're not balanced against one another, but at least they tell you that ahead of time instead of you just randomly shuffling and finding that out, which is a very frustrating experience. So because I love Santorini, I was like, oh great, this should be what do they call it? Knock out of the park, I think is the saying. And unfortunately, no. While I don't think this game is bad, I don't think it's quite as good. And it's very weird because in this game, I actually prefer playing without player powers. And in Santorini, I think that's the worst way to play. I very much enjoy playing with player powers. So it's a weird kind of system of I think the base, just vanilla game of this is more enjoyable because the player powers leave a lot, to be desired, and some are clearly either just more fun to play or they're just better player powers than others. So let's talk about the vanilla game. In Ragnarocks, basically what you're doing is you're moving. You have three Vikings. You have three standees, like that. Just, they're standees. They could be anything. And you move them, and then you summon a runestone, and you place that in a straight line. That's, so you move your Viking, and then you can move summon the runestone anywhere in a straight line. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to block your opponent's Vikings as well as enclosing yourself off, isolating a Viking in a large area. It's kind of a small area control game because once there's an enclosed area, whoever is in that area gets a point for each space. That's pretty much the entire game. Is you pick a Viking, move it, and summon the runestone, and then you go back and forth until no player can make a move. And that portion is I don't know, I just enjoyed that a lot more. It felt a lot more like me versus the other player versus their ability versus my ability. And which sounds just very strange because you could make that same argument against Santorini where it's like, oh well, it's you versus the other player. But I felt like the player powers in Santorini enhanced kind of what you as a player could do, obviously, and then it became like, oh, okay, so they can do this, how am I going to use my player power against that? And maybe there's just a little bit more in layers that Santorini has. Obviously, literally there's layers, and this just doesn't have that. You're really just moving a worker, and then you're placing a runestone, and then it's just kind of eventually the board will close off, and then it's okay, well now, I got 26 points. And so, but with the head-to-head, it was kind of okay, how am I, which Viking am I going to move? How can I block you off so that I can take this larger section? And that's just a little bit more fun. And also kind of on a bunny trail. Whereas I think Santorini's production value is really good, and I think it thematically makes sense to the country. This one was just kind of a mess, and I find the art hideous. But they tried doing the same thing here, where you have your board just kind of 3D like that, and then they just lay on these pegs. But the production value, you just don't need this. You don't need it really in Santorini either. But because this board folds like so, there were multiple times. Well, one, it's like they have a color like a thematic terrain side than a bland side. I always played on this because it's already kind of a mess whenever you're trying to score. Whenever you have to, like, okay, you have all these runestones blocking, you have to kind of, okay, 2, 4, 6, and you have to count that way. It's easier on the non-terrain side than the terrain side. This is just a mess. Like, I think this is atrocious. But what's also, it's not like super easy because they have the coast on the edge here, and multiple times I would be playing, and then my opponent would move, and I'd be like, oh yeah, that's actually, those are spots you can go to, because they just kind of, they're clear on the side, and whenever you're playing, you're really obviously focusing on the colored sections, but like these ones on the very edge just would always kind of blend in to the water for me, so I would never really utilize them. But it's like also not super intuitive whenever you have to score, because of just the sheer nature of you having to count hexes and then be like, oh, did I count those before? It's just obviously not as crystal clear as I made it to the top of a third story in Santorini. Like, this is points based, that one's not. And another reason why I always played on the plain side is because that's how, whenever it folds, that's how the gravity causes it to go down, so it lays flat. The other way, because of this, the way this 3D terrain is, you can even see it, like, it does not lay flat. And multiple times I had it where my friends would be reaching for a runestone, and whenever they pulled their hand back, they would accidentally knock it. And that is, in this game, quite detrimental because of the way that these runestones just lay flat. So if you're having some runestones like lay on the board in a certain pattern, and it gets like bumped, they can slide over, and you're like, oh, where were those? Because that's very important of where they need to be because of just how this game is played. Obviously, you can just be like, well, just be careful, but it's like, it happened, if it only ever happened once, I obviously wouldn't be bringing it up, but it happened multiple times. Enough where it's just kind of almost like, okay, here's your half the runestones, here's my half, just so we don't have to do that. Which is obviously, that's not really the game's fault, but I kind of find that this just didn't work. The 3D terrain didn't work. You don't need it at all. Like, just take your board and lay it flat on the table, because then you don't have that problem. Yeah, you have these stupid hole punches on the side now, but I think that's a lot better than just trying to use the 3D section of it. So anyway, so that was just kind of a side note of kind of the production value. It's like, it didn't need to be, like, it's just not as clean. Because then after playing this recently, I went back to Santorini. I was like, okay, let me see if my opinion has changed. Maybe I just don't even like that game anymore. And no, like when I was putting together the board, like it wasn't like lay something on. They actually snapped into place. It was very, the components were a lot better. The plastic was better. The cardboard was better. And like just the back and forth of me and my opponent in that game was just way better of a head-to-head challenge than I think this was. So, like I said, the base game, vanilla game, I found fine. Like, I don't think this game is horrible by any means, but I just don't think it quite stacks up. So now let's get to the player powers, and there are quite a bit of player powers. I think 30 in the base game, and yeah, because then you have an expansion. You actually have 2 expansions, which I won't be talking about, but So this is how many player powers you get, and some are clearly better than others. Like a good example is Freya score all wild regions in addition to your settled regions. So settled regions are whenever you're by yourself in an enclosed area. Wild regions are an enclosed area with no one in it. So she, like, you could be playing to just close off a bunch of wild regions and you're going to score them and your opponent won't. So there's that one. That's really good. But then you also have Ragnarocks, which is you may move your selected Viking again in the opposite direction to your first move. That's not great because you're only getting still one summon, which is more important really than your move. And because you go, like if you move, straight up and then summon one, you can only move straight back down. And it's kind of like, well, I moved up. I moved the one direction for a reason. There's not a whole massive reason for me to move back. And then you have Jormungandr. If your selected Viking completes a straight line of exactly 3 runestones, take an additional turn selecting the same Viking. So basically, kind of where Ragnarocks lets you take an additional move, which is kind of like another turn, Jormungandr does give you an additional turn. And putting a straight line of exactly 3 runestones is way easier to do because your opponent is like trying to obviously close them off so you can come in and then make a straight 3 and then use that same Viking again and do a whole nother turn. And there is nothing in the rulebook specifically for this one that's like, well, what if I do it again? What if I make another set of 3? Do I just keep going? It says an additional turn, which leads me to believe you can only take 1 additional turn, but could be argued that it's like, well, I did it again, so I get an additional turn. And I get to go, and just because with that ability it allows you to move and summon, you're just leagues better than a lot of these. But like some where a lot of these are really they just seem kind of boring. Where it's just more ways of moving. Like Manny, at the end of your turn, you may move any one of your Vikings 1 hex. Okay, yeah, cool. Like I can just move 1. But then you get ones like Fenrir, which is way cooler of a just totally different way of playing. Which at setup you only have 2 Vikings instead of 3, and it's at the start of your turn. You win immediately if your opponent has a Viking adjacent to one of your Vikings. That's just a completely different way of playing. That's you trying to isolate yourself with one of their Vikings that they can't move out of the way, so then whenever you go, you just win. And there's not enough of that. I mean, Nerthus, when your opponent summons, your opponent cannot create a new region unless there is no other choice. Like, that's putting restrictions on your opponent. That's not bad. Let's see. Tyr, your selected Viking may trade places with an adjacent Viking. Okay, yeah. Like, it might be handy if you're trying to go a certain way. Let's see. Surtur, you may summon a runestone adjacent to your selected Viking and a second runestone in a contested hex adjacent to the first. That could be really good. That allows a lot more summons. So, like I said, these aren't bad, but there's just some that are very clearly better than others. And I don't know, maybe it's just because this seems a lot more simplistic of gameplay of just moving and then just placing a runestone, which obviously Santorini is kind of like that as well, where you're moving and you're placing a building type. But there's just that extra step. There's that extra step of, the layers of buildings that you're doing and trying to block your opponent and make it to where, you can get up to a third one and your opponent can't while utilizing your special ability. I don't know. It's just this one didn't quite hit as well as Santorini did. And I can't quite put my finger on it. And I'm very curious if these games had been reversed, if I would think Santorini is not as good as this one. It's just kind of like, well, this is so close to what Santorini does, but Santorini just has that one extra layer of complexity that maybe it's just a little bit better. Like, I don't think Santorini's like way up here and then Ragnarocks is way down here. I don't think they're that polarizing. I think, honestly, if you hadn't played either and you picked one to play over the other, obviously this is Norse mythology, then you got Greek mythology with the other one. If you're like, oh, I like Norse better, and you played this one, then maybe you would think the way I'm feeling of Santorini versus this. It's just a very weird kind of feeling I have to this. I'm not as wowed by it. I've played it multiple times, and multiple times with and without player powers, and each time I've had some good games, I've had some kind of whatever games. At the end of the day, like I said, I prefer without the player powers just because these don't feel as refined. And I mean, still at the end of the day, it does kind of come down to victory points, whereas the powers there were some powers that were kind of a little more nuanced, where it wasn't about getting to the top. And then the production value of this, I think the runestones look cool. Like, I think but I have the Kickstarter edition, so these are like a very clear turquoise, so they kind of pop. The Viking miniatures they're not as great. So, I don't know. This is a very strange, like, well, I got Santorini. I like that one a lot, so I don't really need this one. And I gotta say, I actually just really despise this artwork. I'm not a huge fan of chibi art either, so I'm not saying like Santorini's art is like, oh man, it's the pinnacle of artistry, and this is just trash. No, I actually don't really like that one either, but at least that one's more cute, and this one's just kind of more weirdly bobblehead, hyper realistic, so it's almost grotesque to me. But obviously art's subjective, so that doesn't really matter. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at with Ragnarocks, and it was very interesting because it had been a while since I played Santorini. I played another game with player powers, and I was like, oh, your power is definitely significantly better, you're gonna win, and lo and behold, they won. And I was like, you know what? Let's try Santorini. It's been a while. Now that I can have a 1-to-1 comparison between the two, let's see if I feel the same way with that game. And no, Santorini was just way more fun of a kind of like outplay your opponent with their better player powers, in my opinion. So Ragnarocks, I think I'm gonna give a 6. Like a 5 or a 6 is kind of where I'm at, like an average to slightly above. It's like average game with player powers, slightly above average without. I think, like I said, if you haven't played either, then just kind of pick your poison, Greek or Norse mythology, and you might enjoy both. Or you might enjoy one over the other. But I'm very curious to see if there's anyone who played this first and then played Santorini and thought Santorini was kind of whatever, and this was a lot more fun. I'm very curious at how they kind of stack up as time goes on. But I don't really see a lot of people talking about this, and then again, I don't really hear a lot of people talk about Santorini either. But anyway, that's my thoughts on Ragnarocks. Let me know what you think of the game in the comments below. Other than that, like, comment, share, and subscribe, and have a wonderful whatever time of day it is for you. Hey everyone, thank you for watching, and I really hope that you enjoyed the video. If you would like to see more of my content, go ahead and click that subscribe button and the bell to be notified whenever I upload any new content. If you feel like supporting the channel, you can go ahead and click that Patreon link to be taken to my Patreon, and any help is truly appreciated. Other than that, stick around for any other run-throughs or reviews or cool top 10s or whatever I feel like putting on. Other than that, like, comment, share, and subscribe, and have a wonderful whatever time of day it is for you.